The Brit Awards after party was not a party in any honest sense of the word. It was a performance of a party. A room full of people performing celebration, performing ease, performing the kind of casual greatness that takes decades to rehearse. The venue was a private space above a restaurant in Mayfair. Low lighting, leather furniture, the smell of cigarette smoke, and something more expensive underneath it. Security at the door, but the real barrier was invisible. You either belonged or you didn't, and everyone inside had spent years learning how to look like they belonged. Kurt Cobain stood near the far wall with a glass he hadn't touched. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't exactly present either. He was doing the thing he often did in rooms like this. Watching, not studying, not calculating, just watching, the way you might watch weather move across a window. Disinterested almost, or something that looked like disinterest to people who didn't know the difference between numbness and stillness. Nirvana had not performed that night. They were in London on the tail end of a European run, and someone had thought it appropriate to include them in the evening's guest list. A gesture of acknowledgement. You exist now. Here is a room full of people who have existed longer. Chris was somewhere near the bar. Dave had found a group of musicians from another band and was talking drums with the focused joy of someone who genuinely loved talking drums. Kurt was at the wall. He watched Mick Jagger work the room. There was no other word for it. Work. Jagger moved through the space like a man who had invented the concept of moving through a space. Every pause was placed. Every laugh arrived on cue. He touched people on the arm when he spoke to them. Not affectionately, but strategically, a small anchor that said, "This moment is ours," and then released them before it became too much. He had been doing this for 30 years. The room was an instrument, and he played it without thinking about it anymore, the same way breathing stops requiring thought. Kurt watched this and felt something he couldn't name. Not envy, not admiration exactly. More like the feeling of watching a species of animal that had evolved for a completely different environment. Jagger eventually stopped near the center of the room, drawn into conversation with a young musician. A guitarist from a band that had charted recently, early 20s, visibly thrilled to be within speaking distance. They were far enough away that the words didn't carry clearly through the ambient noise. But the body language did. Jagger was gesturing. The young guitarist was nodding, the nod of someone receiving doctrine. Kurt couldn't hear the words, but someone standing closer could. A journalist, a publicist, a friend of a friend. The exact geometry of who told whom first would blur over years into something approximate, something that everyone had heard from someone reliable. What Jagger said roughly was this: the kid's interesting, but he doesn't control the stage. The stage controls him. Chaos isn't charisma. The audience will figure that out eventually. They always do. He said it without cruelty. That was the thing people who'd been there always mentioned. He wasn't being dismissive. He was being diagnostic. The way a very experienced surgeon might look at someone else's work and note, clinically, where the incision was wrong. Not malicious, just certain. The young guitarist nodded again, more carefully this time. Kurt across the room was still at the wall. He set his untouched glass on a nearby ledge and said something brief to the person nearest him. No one could remember what afterward. And then he was moving toward the door. Quietly. No announcement. No visible emotion. The kind of exit that takes a moment to register, and then you're not entirely sure when it happened. He took a car back to the hotel. He didn't mention it to Chris that night. He didn't mention it to anyone, as far as any record shows. Whether he heard Jagger's words directly or heard an approximate version of them later, or never heard them at all, no account is certain. What is certain is that he left, and that the leaving was as quiet as everything else he did. Outside, London in February was cold in the specific way that cold cities are cold. Not brutal, just indifferent. The car moved through it. Kurt looked out the window. The lights of Mayfair gave way to other neighborhoods, other lights, other people performing their own evening versions of being alive. The tour continued. 31 dates across Europe in weather that ranged from tolerable to punishing. Venues that varied in size but shared a common backstage quality. The same low-ceiling concrete, the same industrial fluorescent flicker, the smell of old stage equipment and new sweat. The road had its own grammar, and Kurt had been learning it long enough that it no longer required translation. What the tour also had, what someone had been quietly accumulating without anyone thinking much about it, was footage, a documentary crew, or something close to one, a camera that appeared at sound checks, at load-ins, at the edges of backstage hours. Most of it was the ordinary texture of touring, equipment cases, hallway conversations, the dead time between arrival and performance, the kind of footage that looks like nothing until it doesn't. Someone on Jagger's side eventually saw some of it, a reel or a selection of clips sent over as part of some broader exchange, a music press thing, a label thing, the exact mechanism lost to the specific amnesia that settles over industry transactions. It doesn't matter how Jagger came to be watching it. What matters is what he saw when he did. The clip ran less than 2 minutes. Pre-show. A venue in Hamburg or possibly Rotterdam. Accounts differ on which night. The backstage area was the usual thing. People moving, checking equipment, the rising noise of a crowd beginning to fill the room beyond the walls. All the standard kinetic energy of 30 minutes before stage time. And Kurt sitting alone in a corner of the room. Not in a chair exactly. More on a road case, one of the large black equipment trunks that serve as backstage furniture on tours that can't afford actual furniture. His knees were up, his arms loose. He was wearing a cardigan that had seen several weeks of Europe. His eyes were closed. He wasn't asleep. You could tell he wasn't asleep. The quality of the stillness was different. It wasn't absence, it was attention. He was perfectly, completely still in the specific way of someone listening to something that the room couldn't hear. Around him, movement. People checking in ears, reviewing set lists, the bass tech running a quick check on the amp line. Normal pre-show, controlled chaos. All of it a foot away, 2 feet away, moving around him like water around a stone. He didn't react to any of it. Not as if he was blocking it out, as if it genuinely wasn't registering as relevant. The camera held on him for maybe 40 seconds. Then someone walked into frame, and the shot cut away. That was the clip. Jagger watched it twice. The second time, he didn't say anything for a while afterward. There is a version of what came next that several people have repeated over the years. At dinners, in interviews, in the offhand way that someone mentions something they've been thinking about longer than they intended. The version is consistent enough that it holds a kind of weight. Jagger said, to whoever was in the room with him at the time, I've been going to stages for 30 years to take them. That kid was going to belong to one. He paused. I didn't understand that those were different things until just now. The distinction is not obvious until it is, and then it cannot be unseen. Mick Jagger had built one of the great careers in rock music on the principle of conquest. The stage as territory, the audience as something to be won, held, worked, satisfied. He was extraordinary at it. The preparation, the movement, the presence, decades of refinement had made it look effortless, which meant it had become a different kind of effort, the effort of maintaining effortlessness. The smile placed correctly, the pause before the chorus, held a beat longer than feels comfortable, just long enough to make the room need what comes next. He had mastered the negotiation between performer and audience. He knew every frequency of that relationship, every leverage point, every way to make 15,000 people feel like he was singing specifically to them and only them. This was real skill. This was decades of work. No one could take that from him. But what he saw in that clip was something his skill had no language for. Kurt wasn't negotiating with the stage. He wasn't preparing to conquer it. He was sitting in the 20 minutes before walking onto it with his eyes closed, not building himself up, not running through the set in his head, not managing his energy or his fear or his presence. He was listening. To what? Impossible to say. The music in his head, maybe. The particular silence that precedes very loud noise. Something that had nothing to do with the audience waiting on the other side of the wall and everything to do with whatever it was that made him need to be on a stage in the first place. The audience would get what came through that door. But the preparation for it, the source of it, was not about them. Jagger had always walked toward a stage. Kurt had always walked toward something else. And the stage happened to be where it was. The tour ended in Munich in March. Kurt flew back to Seattle. The months that followed were loud in every direction. The album cycle, the press, the specific madness of being the most discussed band in the world, while being, at your core, a band that had only ever wanted to make a certain kind of noise in small rooms. The scale of it was a kind of weather. You couldn't negotiate with it. You could only move through it or not. Jagger's comment from the Mayfair after-party made its way through the usual channels. Music press, industry gossip, the oral tradition of people who had been in rooms where things were said. By the time it reached print, it had been softened, qualified, stripped of whatever specific tone he'd actually used. He did not publicly address it. He continued in those years to work rooms the way he had always worked them. The skill did not diminish. The stage did not become less his. But the clip, the 40 seconds of a young man sitting still on a road case in Hamburg or Rotterdam, apparently stayed with him in a different way. He mentioned it in an interview years later, not in relation to Kurt initially, in relation to a broader question about performance and presence and what the difference is between an artist and an entertainer, which is a question that gets asked of people who have been both. He was thoughtful about it in the way he sometimes was when the question was genuine. And then he said, I saw footage once of a musician before a show, just sitting, not doing anything, completely still. And I realized I had never done that in my life before a performance. I'd always been activating, getting ready, building toward it. And here was someone who was already there, already wherever the music lived. He was just waiting for the stage to catch up to him. The interviewer asked who it was. Jagger smiled in the way that means the answer is obvious. Kurt Cobain, he said. Who else? The word that Jagger had used in Mayfair, chaos, was not wrong exactly. Kurt's relationship to a stage did involve a kind of chaos. Things broke. Things hurt. The distance between the music in his head and the music that came out of the speakers was sometimes violent in its narrowness, like current through a wire too thin for the load. But chaos is not the absence of control. Sometimes chaos is what happens when you let something through that the control would have stopped. Jagger had spent 30 years perfecting the filter. Kurt had spent his entire career, short, bright, already ending, before anyone thought to count the years, learning to remove it. Neither approach was wrong. Both produced something real. The difference was the source. Jagger went to the stage to demonstrate what he could do. Kurt went to the stage because there was something in him that had no other exit. The audience felt both, in different ways, with different parts of themselves. Jagger's audiences left a show exhilarated, satisfied, their expectations met and then exceeded. Kurt's audiences left a show unsettled sometimes, or transformed in ways they couldn't articulate for days. There is a distinction between being entertained and being reached. Both matter. They are not the same thing. Jagger is still performing, still working rooms, still placing the pause before the chorus with the precision of a man who has done it 10,000 times and knows exactly why it works. He has said in more than one context over more than one decade that the clip changed something in how he thought about what a stage is for. Not what he does. The craft is the craft, and you don't unlearn 30 years of muscle memory. But what he thinks it is. I always thought the stage was where you went to be bigger than yourself, he said in one version of this reflection. That kid made me think maybe it's where you go to finally be exactly yourself. Maybe those are the same size. Maybe they're not. He left it there, didn't resolve it, which for Jagger is unusual. The road case Kurt was sitting on in that clip, Hamburg or Rotterdam or whichever night it was eventually lost to the normal entropy of touring equipment. No one held on to it. No one knew to. The 40 seconds of footage exists, in archives somewhere, in the kind of careful custody that surrounds anything from that period, that band, those years. Whether Jagger has watched it again since, no account says. But the stillness in it, a young man with his eyes closed, 20 minutes before everything got very loud, listening to something no one else in the room could hear, that is the kind of image that does not require repeated viewing. It stays, the way certain things stay, not because they're dramatic, because they're true, and the stage waited for him. The way stages wait, indifferent, enormous, patient, not knowing yet what was about to come through the door.